Hey there, Eager to Pleasers. Thanks so much for joining me on the Eager to Please podcast. We are so fortunate to have with us today a special guest from Baltimore, Maryland, who has quite literally turned her life around from what she's defined as complete despair to feeling the most alive and fulfilled with purpose than she's ever felt before. Joining us today is MaryBeth Hyland, award-winning author of the book Permission to be Human and founder of Spark Vision, a values-based mindfulness, coaching, speaking, and training program she runs with her husband. Welcome, MaryBeth, to the show. So glad that you are on this episode with us today.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'd like to start just by letting our listeners know how the two of us got connected in the first place. And I feel like the universe intentionally put you in my path, as silly as that sounds. You were looking to extend your outreach to people struggling with finding themselves and starting with setting boundaries, the same issues that I was having personally. And I was looking for someone who was qualified to talk about those things in greater detail. As you and I had talked before, you know that I have a younger sister who passed away in 2006. And every year since her accident, some of her amazing college friends who have now become my amazing friends would host an annual memorial where we'd meet up in Ocean City, Maryland to celebrate her life. And unfortunately, when COVID hit, our annual meetup had to take a hiatus until this year, when I had reached out to those girls and I was like, hey, we haven't seen each other in a while. I really miss you. How about we get together in September to celebrate her birthday instead of waiting until her anniversary in November, which ironically is on 11/11. So I ended up flying up to Baltimore, and as women do, they're catching up and they're chit-chatting. And I had mentioned that I was starting a podcast about people pleasing, what that means and what it ends up costing a person. And Sandy, one of our now mutual friends, perked right up and was like, oh my gosh, I met this amazing woman on a flight. And the two of us got to talking about the work that you do with mindfulness, and she thought the two of us should connect. And so I guess you could say the rest is history, because here you are.
Yeah, I loved it. It was really an experience with Sandy that I've gotten very good luck with who I've been sat next to in planes. And Sandy was just one of those like really fortunate, good luck humans that I got to sit next to, and we just hit it off right away. And we've just stayed connected for years. I'm talking like, I don't know, 6-7 years now. So it's really cool to think you can meet somebody by just sitting next to them on a plane and wind up having that type of long-term connection and relationship.
That is awesome. And well, interestingly, I didn't realize that it had been 6 or 7 years past, because the way she described it, it was like, oh my gosh, I just met this woman on the plane. So I'm like, no, oh gosh, this was meant to be. So she must have kept you in her back pocket for when someone really needed your help. So I'm so grateful that you're here, and I feel like we do have a lot of things in common as far as where we came from, being the workaholic, slaves to our jobs, to our lives. And would love to start there. If we could dive in a little bit to your story and talk about your journey from despair to complete freedom and feeling at peace with yourself. So what did that look like for you, and how did you manage to come up for air?
Yeah. And I'll say, Natalie, there are definitely levels and layers to all of that, as you know, in your own journey. But really, my journey to taking my power back and creating more freedom really started, oh my goodness, it must have been like 15 years ago or so now. And it was an experience where I was a rock star at work. I was getting all of the awards. I was getting all the promotions. I was seen as like this great leader in the community. And in Baltimore, there is a little bit of that like social influence, ego stuff that can kick in pretty quickly and pretty easily. And I was just constantly crushing all of my goals and just creating things that never existed in a way that I was getting national awards for it and global recognition. But the reality was I was dying on the inside. Mm-hmm. You know, I had this massive inner self-hate monologue that was basically a broken record on repeat, which was essentially, if I don't produce and I don't get to the next level and I don't exceed expectations and I don't blow it out of the water, then I'm a total failure. And so the bar was like 150%. Like,
right.
That was the expectation for what was normal and what was meaningful and useful of my energy. And so what happened was, while I was getting all of this praise, all of these rewards, external validation, what it wound up being is that it didn't go in, like it didn't seep in. It wasn't coming from the inside out. I was looking everywhere, all around me, for everybody else to tell me I was good enough. But I never had the tools to teach myself that I was good enough and that I didn't need other people to approve of that. And that really came from being able to go on a really deep journey. It started with psychodynamic therapy, in which I was able to understand that this pattern that was playing out at work, where my therapist told me I was a work addict, and she helped me to understand that the addiction piece comes from not being able to control it. Like I literally couldn't stop. And so I don't know about you, Natalie, but it was the kind of thing that I was working, 20 hours in a day. And that was like normal because I wouldn't sleep. I would sleep for like 1 hour increments, and then I would wake up and work on something and then pass back out and then wake back up.
Wow. That's so wild.
I mean, it was so unhealthy. I wasn't every single day, but that was at least one day a week where I had racing thoughts. And the only thing I knew what to do with my racing thoughts was to wake up and work, because I could do something about it. And so it finally got to a point where my husband, who at the time worked in finance, and he was up at 5 a.m., one morning he rolled over in bed and he just said, "It's so good to see you." Oh. And I was like, "What do you mean? Like, I see you all the time." He's like, "Well, usually by the time I get up, you've either already on your way to work or you've passed out on the couch with a laptop on your chest. So I don't usually see you when I wake up in the morning, because you're not in bed when I go to bed and you're not in bed when I wake up." And it wasn't him being mean, right? It was actually him being extremely loving and just being like, "Oh, you're here. It's so good to see you here." And it took that loving reflection for me to realize I had a problem. Mm-hmm. And I did not know what to do. I truly didn't think there was any other choice of how to channel that energy into something other than being more productive, creating, producing, doing more. And so when I went in to get the support of therapy for the first time in this kind of way, she really helped me to make the connections of understanding that unworthiness, that constant sense of needing to prove myself over and over again, really came from my domestication at home. And really, particularly with my father, who was a narcissist and extremely abusive, really drilled hard into me that you need to always be producing. You always need to be leveling up. If you don't have a certain title or you're not making a certain amount of money, you are a total failure. And the only way that you can be a good use of life is if you accomplish, these boxes that you check throughout your life. And so while I had rejected that on a surface level and stopped going into pre-med and instead went into social work, that was the first big change, because it was all about like, what can I do to make money? What can I do to make money? What can I do to make money? Versus like, what is my soul's calling and what am I here to do with my life? And so what I didn't realize is how much of that domestication and that programming really sticks with you into your adulthood, especially if you've never looked at it, especially if you've never done anything to recognize that there's another option. So I found it to be extremely powerful to be able to say, "Oh, this is the wounded little girl in me that just wants to be good enough. She just wants to be loved. She just wants to be worthy." And so now I can witness her playing that out as an adult and start to take care of her differently and to treat her in a way that I can, now that I'm an adult, and I can take care of that little girl.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something about control, which I feel like has been a double-edged sword with me, because being a perfectionist and liking things a certain way, and I have gotten feedback on myself about, well, you're a control freak. You aren't able to see different perspectives. And honestly, I do think it took the divorce for me to be like, okay, there might be something to that, because when you're running a household and a family and working and doing all the stuff, you have to run a tight ship because every piece has to fit in the puzzle. And letting go of some of that control was really hard. I ran it a certain way so everyone could get to where they needed to go, and trying to make everything, nice and happy for everyone. And so I feel like that control piece can be both a blessing and a curse. So I don't know if you have any guidance or some insight on that. Like how do you get comfortable with letting go of some of that stuff?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the first thing to do is to check in with your mindset, because the pressure and the intensity of control, especially when it's like running a household, right? Like other lives that you are technically responsible for, right? Like, especially if they're under 18, right? You are responsible for them. But to be able to understand what's going on in your mind, what is the story you're telling yourself about what this control means about you, right? Or what it means about your kids, or what it means about your parenting, or what it means about you as an executive, or whatever, right? So to be able to go in and to understand, what am I telling myself about this? Why does this feel so heavy? So for example, I actually run a community, a monthly community where we do group coaching together, and it's all around values alignment. And this was actually a big topic that's come up recently, especially going into the new year, of people wanting to soften around their schedules and recognize that they aren't, even though they want to be in control, they're not always in control, because things change.
Yes.
Like life happens. People have emergencies, or there's some kind of new priority that becomes the big thing. And so the biggest opportunity that I really always am telling people is, what are you telling yourself about the control you need? Because if you're telling yourself, my schedule has to go exactly this way, right, in order for me to be successful this day, then you've immediately set yourself up for failure. Mm-hmm. Because you're immediately telling yourself a story that if it doesn't happen exactly this way, then I have failed for the day. Versus being able to understand, okay, I recognize that I've been telling myself that this is what it means to be a good mom, right? But now I'm realizing that actually to be a good mom is to learn how to be in flow and make changes. And that's a different version of the same exact experience, but being able to say, I'm releasing control when it comes to everything and everybody except for my own reactions.
Which is a hard thing to do, but
so hard, right? It's so hard. It's such a muscle. It is such a muscle to strengthen, because it really is the kind of thing that I'll tell you, in my own life, in my own personal life, I always used to think, well, if I could just explain it the right way, or if I could just help them understand where I'm coming from, then they won't behave that way anymore. Like, I can control other people because I will explain it and they won't want to hurt me because I've told them that it's hurtful, right? And so that, for me in my own journey, has been my biggest releasing of control, of thinking that if I control myself and how I show up, then it's going to influence the way other people show up, which absolutely it does. I'm not saying it doesn't. But you cannot control how somebody else chooses to step up or not.
Yeah.
Right. And that is something that I feel the most freedom in my whole life ever in this moment. I'm so grateful to be in this place, because as you mentioned in the opening, this was not the case. Right. And in fact, last year I was struggling with really intense suicidal ideation. So this is not like
terrible.
Oh, I'm like this and it's set on that function and now we're there forever. Right. It's a journey. And so last year, when I was in a place of just despair, feeling like a total victim, feeling like I was never going to be able to get out of this, I just had a series of really unfortunate events. And then my sister sued us for $100 million.
Wow, that's
a lot. And
so,
yeah. So obviously there's a lot involved in making a statement like that. That's a whole other story. But it's the kind of thing that I was really in my head of like, I'm fucked forever. It was one of these like, this is going to be my life. Like, this is my life forever. What is the point in even trying anymore? My dad did this to my mom. This is a pattern of mental illness in my family. This is going to be the rest of my life. I'm going to be drained of all my finances just to have a lawyer to keep up with this, just to not have to deal with it. Right. And so I just created this container of doom and despair because I felt so out of control. Right. It felt like I had no control. I was the victim of this totally bogus experience. And then, of course, my vibration was so low that I was not having the other abundance that I normally would experience, right? Outside of that, with my work, with my relationships, with different things. And just feeling like I had really put on this like wet, moldy blanket of like sadness and despair that I just, when you get to that place where it almost feels weirdly comforting because it's like what you know, and you can just be a victim, and it's just like, I'm a victim, so I'm going to stay a victim.
That's a great analogy. I feel like it's just heavy and
and it stinks, it's bad. There's nothing good that comes of it. But when you're in such a place of feeling so out of control, so in despair, it feels like the one thing you can control is protecting your hell and your victimhood of how bad this is. And I can control that real easy, right? I can really easily make a case for that to be what I'm controlling. And so what's really cool about this question about how you can shift your mindset around it is, here I am a year later from that experience. The lawsuit happened again. Like, it came back, it was dismissed, and then it came forward again. All the conditions are the same as far as like unfortunate series of events are happening all the time, right? Like all that kind of stuff. But the difference is my mind. Mm-hmm. I have just completely taken full ownership and complete control of the story that I'm telling myself about what this means. Because in just that example of being sued, it was the kind of thing that I went into 6 months of intense depression. Mm. And then the case was dismissed. We didn't even have to go to court. There was nothing. It was dismissed immediate, like nothing. So I looked at my husband and I said, what if we just didn't even worry about this the last 6 months? How much different would our lives have been? Like, we could have chosen that. Mm-hmm. But there was obviously more work and more healing that was required. And it required that level of depression and going through, some really intense inner soul work that was required to heal and evolve and get to the next level of consciousness, which if I didn't do that, when the lawsuit came back again, I would have gone right back to where I was, right? Because I'm out of control. I'm a victim again, all these things. Mm-hmm. But the truth was, I was always in control. I was always in control. I was always in control of the container that I was creating for myself in my mind. And so to be able to pull out and understand what are the pieces of what I'm telling myself to be true, and how can I rewrite that so that it's actually serving me and feeling more grounded and more in control in this moment.
Mm-hmm. I love you were able to get out of that. I don't even know what else to call it. It's like a dark hole that just kept like piling on the shit. It's something that takes so much work and awareness that you have the control to worry about you in your lane. You can't do anything else about anyone else. And so when I flip the mirror and look at my own life, I had to make the choice to get out of that so I could, float to the top, because I really did feel like I had a ball and chain and I was drowning and I couldn't breathe. And, what good are you if you can't breathe yourself? And I just needed to be an example for my kids to show them that it's okay to shift. Yes, I am a creature of habit and I like to have things the way I like to have them, but sometimes you have to make changes to better yourself, to better your life. And I want to touch on your book for a second, because I love how it's kind of like an overarching theme that you work with organizations, but the core message that I pulled out of it, so tell me if I'm wrong, is that you have to kind of be good with yourself. It's like you're only as strong as all of the individual pieces in your organization, and coming back to your personal core values. And if those are not in alignment with either your employer or your family or the life you're living, then chaos is going to ensue and things are not going to go the way that you think they should go. Back to the control thing. So let's just talk about that for a second, like your book and what kind of sparked that interest to write a book. I'm sure you have all of these things pent up for your own experiences that you wanted to share with other people, but the core message being work on yourself. What are your core values?
Yeah, totally. Well, I will say, like many people during the pandemic, it was this experience of what am I going to do with this new lifestyle, right? Yeah. Like I was booked to be traveling all over the country, to be doing retreats and facilitating workshops. And, my schedule was quite robust. And then like everybody else, everything came to a screeching halt and figuring out how to do it online and all that. And it was this experience where I had been saying for years that I was going to write a book, years and years and years and years, but I never had time. And so it really felt like this divine timing of, you want to make an excuse now? Like you want to say you don't have enough time now, and you just cut weeks of just travel time. You just got weeks back in your life just from traveling. And so it was an experience where I said, okay, these are the conditions I need, where I'm essentially like just at home doing this, writing this book, because the truth was, while the book is, like you said, it's very much written about leaders and how you can lead through your values and create a culture that's in alignment with your values. I had been doing workplace culture consulting for my whole career at that point, like when I started my business. So I guess that was 6 years I was doing workplace culture consulting around core values and how to create a culture that's in alignment with them. I got really good at doing it with higher education and hospital systems. This was never my goal. It just happened to be, when one refers you, then they refer you, right? Like you just get into these. So I was doing core values work with hundreds, if not thousands of employees of organizations. And as rewarding as it was, ultimately, there was always a good percentage of the population that was forced to be there. And there was a good amount of people who, depending on the size of the organization, were going to try to keep the things the way they are because they're very uncomfortable with even talking about things like values, let alone looking at them and looking how they relate to themselves. And so writing this book was really almost like a passing of the torch for me, of feeling like I'm complete when it comes to my work in doing workplace culture analysis and then doing multi-year engagements with companies to do culture shift. Like I felt like that was no longer the highest and best use of my energy. I wanted to work with people who were 100% in, and they were choosing to be in, right? Like they were wanting to do the work versus me convincing them that it's a good idea. And in time they will, 9 out of 10 times. The people who were the ones kicking and screaming wind up being the biggest advocates for it, because they were the ones who actually really needed it the most, but just were a little bit scared and needed some loving hand holding to begin the process, which is something I'm quite good at. But it's not what I want to do, right? Like just because you're good at something doesn't mean that that's the best thing for you to be doing.
So funny you say that. Yeah.
Yeah, boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Boundaries with yourself. And so the book was really like, I want to create a guide in which I could literally hand this to anybody in a workplace who cares about values, who cares about culture, who you can say, here you go. You don't need me. I can be your coach if you want support in that way. But really, I'm going to hand you the step-by-step guide of what I have been doing for almost a decade now that has been proven over and over and over again to work. And so it was kind of like a passing of the baton, but also a closing of a chapter of I knew that I could not die without this information being somewhere that other people could access, because I've never seen anybody else do values work the way that I do. I love Brené Brown. I have so many people who come to work with me who are trained in her work, her values work, and are like, MaryBeth, it's not even close to the level of what you're doing, because you're going into all the nooks and crannies of life versus kind of the big picture of how we can look at this and really operationalizing it. So if anybody who's listening is really I want to figure out what that is for myself and for work, I would highly recommend you check out the book, Permission to be Human, The Conscious Leader's Guide to Creating a Values-Driven Culture, because it really is written so that anyone can lift the exercises from the book and use them as their own and be able to go on a journey in their own experience as a leader in understanding where they as an individual have been in and out of alignment with their values and how being in alignment with those values is going to create just this exponential return on that inner investment, because you are going to be showing and guiding people the way through the embodiment versus the professing of what it should be.
Well, I also want to throw a plug in there too for people to go to your website, because there's a quiz that you have on your website about values, and it kind of walks you through like what are your core values 100%, like you live and die by them, and then it kind of like scales down from there. So that helped me. I mean, I kind of already knew where I fell, but some of them are kind of interesting, you know. And I know you say not all encompassing, but it's a good starting point to kind of see like what's important to you and what's not important to you. And those actually are helpful too, because as a people pleaser, sometimes I take on other people's things where I'm like, why am I even doing this? Because I don't even care to do that, but I'm doing it because, you know, I want to make that person happy, or you know, whatever the situation is. So.
Well, that kind of situation that you're talking about, that could be one of your values of connection, or being reliable, or loyalty. I don't know how they fall in your values profile, but that feeling like it overrides the rest, right? Mm-hmm. So there are shadows to core values too.
For sure.
So as much as it's like connection is this amazing core value that I think most people have at some level, some degree, very rarely do people think about the shadow of connection when you're just like going over and above for everybody else and putting yourself behind because you think that doing this for somebody else is more important. And so anytime I'm working with somebody, especially in a one-on-one situation where they say that their value is connection, their first invitation is connection with themselves. Okay, so what does it look like to connect with yourself more deeply and see what that feels like as far as a rejuvenating intrinsic motivator versus it always has to be out, because really values come from within. And so that's actually a huge misunderstanding a lot of times about values, especially when I start working with people in the beginning. They sometimes think like, oh, well, I want to really focus on this core value of integrity. And I'm like, okay, can you tell me more about why, right? What's going on that you feel out of alignment and not being integrous? And they're like, oh no, it's like, I want the people around me to have more integrity. And I'm like, well, that's not about what it means to live in your core values, right? That would be their work to do. Do you feel that you already are integrous? Are you an integrous person? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm like over the top integrous. I'm like, then that's not a value you need to work on, right? That's one that's locked in. Like you can honor and celebrate that about yourself, but you don't need to put more energy and effort into it with the hope that other people will change. This is really about how you can do that for yourself. And that's a huge misunderstanding when it comes to values. Is like, if I have this value, it means that other people around me will share that, just because it happens a lot in work, right? When companies say we have certain values, they just assume that people that work there are going to be on board with that without actually doing that as a part of the hiring process, like understanding if those are their shared core values, or giving them an opportunity to even reflect and see how it relates to them as an individual. It's kind of like, here you go. You're supposed to care about this because we said so. It's on the poster. It's on the wall. It's in the parking garage. You care about this. Versus, how is me as an individual human being, how do I relate to these values? And what truly are mine, and what maybe aren't, that I can have an understanding about, but I don't have to say they're mine if they're really not. And that really, going back to boundaries, that's a huge thing. I think so often, especially at work and in families and in communities, really any kind of tribal spaces, we humans are wanting to fit in most of the time. We want to be accepted. We want to be worthy. We want to be validated that we're a team player, or that we are a valuable member of that group. And so we often will put aside our own core values in order to make other people feel comfortable and to create a dynamic in which it's just easier, quote unquote, right? Like, oh, it's just easier, but actually you're just dimming your light to make other people comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. So the other side of that where I felt really challenged is that I thought that I'm being selfish for wanting to work on myself. Like, oh, if I wanted to go and do XYZ and I didn't want to take my kids, I felt guilty and like I was not doing my job as a mom or a wife or whatever. And coming to terms with, you know what, it's okay to have, I mean, in all seriousness, I totally lost myself as a person. Didn't know who I was, aside from wiping noses and changing diapers and, you know, making meals and cleaning the house. And that's all fine and dandy. But I'm like, this is not the 1950s and 60s. Like, I feel like, you know, I got a college education. I'm not even using that. And I wasn't at one point. And I just felt so lost and wanting to get back into why I was put on this earth. Like, I lost my purpose. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. And I just, to your point, like, I didn't even know what my values were anymore because I just totally crumbled. And I felt selfish for wanting to go and find what lit my fire again. And so, yeah.
I'm sure you have singing a different tune about that now.
I totally do.
Yeah, obviously this whole podcast.
Exactly. And not for it to come across as like, oh my God, she totally fell off the rocker and she's some sort of psycho person who just is completely ranting and raving and on her soapbox. It's not that at all. I hope that this brings some awareness to people that, you know, it is okay to find your inner peace and balance so you can, you know, help the people that you love. Because I don't know, I felt like I wasn't doing a service to anyone in my life at one point because I'm just here. I'm just like floundering around, Groundhog Day, day in and day out. And it just felt so blah, you know? Yeah. I don't know how else to describe it.
So human, Natalie. It's just such a human experience. And I think especially in the conditions that you describe, right? Of like, you're just like wiping nose and making meals and moving from one thing to the next. And you kind of lost like, what else is there? And it's such a common human experience that I'm really grateful more people are talking about, right? And it's become more normalized to voice those feelings and to there's like thousands of different things you can do now that you can find online, right? If not millions, to support you in a journey like that. And so what you said, like the first step is that story of what it like being selfish, of feeling like it's selfish for me to take care of myself. I think especially for women, especially for moms, that is a very, very common story. And so what I love is what you just said a few minutes ago of like the reason that you had to get divorced was because you had to do it to show your kids, right? Like you had to show your kids, like, this is the kind of mom you have. And this is the kind of person that what I'm standing for. And I'm not going to be the kind of mom who's being drugged underwater for the rest of my life. I'm going to show you that even though it's hard, it's a choice that you can make. And so it's really powerful to be able to flip the story, right? So if someone who's listening right now is saying, oh yeah, I really feel that too. I feel so selfish. I'm actually working with a woman right now who she used to go to yoga class as her
outlet.
Mm-hmm. Her one thing, right, that she gave herself was like a yoga class a few days a week. And we started working with each other. She hadn't gone to that class in like a couple years. And so she started going to the yoga class and she was telling me like how much better. She just feels like this amazing, like a better human being. But then when she would get home, she would feel like she was being judged. And she was directly being told by her spouse that this was neglecting the kids, right? So this is a real, like, talk about not just your own story, but then being told outright what you're doing is taking away from our family versus it's aiding our family requires a really, really higher level of self-compassion and boundaries, right? Because you can't control their people, right? What we were saying earlier. But if you can start to understand how to communicate that this is for the family, that your healing, your wellness, your groundedness is going to have way more of an impact on the well-being of your family than grinding it out an extra hour that you were at the yoga class, right? Or whatever it may be.
Right.
It's just such a fascinating thing, I think, when people are programmed into old stories of what it means to be a good fill in the blank, right? Mom, spouse, parent. It becomes an experience of, I have to follow the rules of other people that other people have said, that other people have agreed upon, of what that means, versus what actually are my needs, what activates my values, and how can I be a vessel of that embodiment and possibility so that not only I benefit from it, but every single other human being that I ever come in contact benefits from it, because I am in a place of vibrating in a way that other people are getting rejuvenated simply with my presence.
Right. Yeah, right? Absolutely. For sure.
I don't know. Are you familiar with the 4 Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz?
I am not.
Okay. Definitely add it to you can read it. It's like a 2.5 hour audiobook. You can read it in a day. Very easy. It's amazing. It's incredible. And I have had the good fortune of being an apprentice for Don Miguel and traveling with him. And one of the things that they really talk about is getting to be very clear on how you were domesticated and how that creates the stories of what other people then double down on you of, I'm going to keep, right? The partner saying this is not good for the kids could be an extension of the way you were raised, of domesticated, of thinking, oh, well, there's another piece of evidence for that and that truth and that possibility. And so the bigger invitation in being able to truly advocate for yourself and to do what's best for you is to honor that you can make a different choice. You can break that domestication. What they call, Don Miguel calls it, is protecting your own hell.
Okay.
So that we protect our own hell. There's the judge and the victim, and they are the gatekeepers of the hell that we protect. And so if we're telling ourselves that it's selfish to take care of ourselves, to go on a healing journey, to prioritize our well-being, whatever it is, that's the judge protecting your hell, saying, wagging the finger at you and saying, if you do this, you're not a good person. And so the invitation is then to say, am I going to choose to protect my hell? Or am I going to choose to create heaven on earth? And what would that look like to flip that story, to set a boundary and to make a new choice, forgive myself for that pattern, and recognize that I have more power than I realize?
Yeah, 100%. So true. What I found so interesting by what you just said is that your upbringing could potentially, and most likely 100%, has something to do with the way you're formed and the way you think and the way you carry out your life as an adult, which for me was so hard when I was starting this podcast to chunk those things out into separate categories, because they all feed into each other. Like they're all interrelated and intertwined. And so, there might be these overarching themes, but they start bleeding into the other ones where, who knows? It's just fascinating to me, all of this stuff and how it works and how things, just kind of play out in real life. But the other thing that you had said about figuring out a way to communicating your needs and wants, or for lack of a better term, maybe even boundaries clearly, was a struggle for me. And I guess I still have a struggle doing that, because I just don't want to, piss anyone off or, ruffle any feathers, but it's so important. So everyone is aware of expectations. And so I know you touch about that in the book as well, but do you have suggestions for our listeners, if in case they haven't read the book yet, on how we can communicate our boundaries clearly? People may or may not like what you have to say, but how do you do that in a way that it's like non-confrontational and that benefits everyone?
Yeah, I love this question. So, Natalie, the next book I'm writing is called Finding Freedom Through Boundaries.
Oh, okay. I can't wait to read that one too.
So there'll be a way more deep dive in this. I also have a boundaries boot camp that's 5 days that really goes through this in depth. Like, how can you really in depth go through a process of understanding what your values are, how you can set boundaries around them, and then the communicating them is so huge. The first thing is to recognize that boundaries start with yourself. That's the first thing, because a lot of times we think, well, they should just know by now.
Right, exactly. Right.
Like, don't they know that's not okay? And so then we don't say anything about it because it feels like they should just know better by now, right? Or this is just how it is. And so that's actually the first boundary, is with yourself being able to say, this is my opportunity to speak up, to use my voice and to stand in my power from a place of loving accountability, to be able to not only support me, but to support them, because we're going to have a better relationship. One of my favorite quotes is, boundaries are the distance in which I can love you and me simultaneously.
So good.
It's so good because it's really it. Boundaries are loving. Boundaries are helping to teach ourselves and others how we want to be treated, right? And so when somebody can treat you with love in the way that it's a good boundary for you, it's such a gift, because it winds up being something that everybody benefits even more, way more exponentially when you're clear about that. So the part of communicating them, I would say there's like 4 steps leading up to the communication part, which is really around like knowing why you need to have this, right? What is the value alignment or violation that's happening here? Then being able to get really grounded in yourself, in your body, right? Because here's the thing, there are times that you need to set a boundary as a reaction of like, this is not okay. This is absolutely not happening. No, right? Like, especially when it comes to safety,
right.
That is not something that you need to get like fully grounded and regulated. Like, a no is a no when it comes to certain situations. But when it's the kind of thing that's like, say, with your mother-in-law and holiday plans that you know is going to happen every year, and it's not really an emergency, but it's something that has just regularly been something that comes up over and over and over again, that's a time when you can really do kind of more processing and be able to get yourself in a place where you have a container of being grounded through mindfulness practices and other things. But this is the communication part. I felt like I had to say those other things before.
Well, it makes sense. It leads up to it.
Yeah. So the communication, this is my favorite. I went through a crucial conversations training many years ago, and this was the one thing I took with me. Intent before content. So the idea is, before you go into setting a boundary, like, I'm not going to be able to make all the pies this year for the birthday party. Before you say that, what is your intention, right? What is your intention? What is it that you want to experience? And how do you want to feel as a result of that? So using that example of like your mother-in-law and not being able to make food for a party, it could be the kind of thing where you start with the intent. So it could be something like, I'm so looking forward to this party, and I want to make sure that I can show up in my best energy and be able to enjoy it with everybody else. And then you just stop. And you just give it a minute. You don't jump into the content after that. You just give it a minute. And you can even say, if you want to add a little bonus, you can invite them in with a question, and you could say, I'm pretty sure that's what you want too, to be able to show up with lots of energy and feeling really good at this gathering. Is it fair to think that's what we both want? Right? So stop. And then you stop. That's actually a huge part of what I coach people with, because a lot of people want to start with the content, right? And so you just kind of feel it out energetically, and then you can decide if now's the time to go into the content. So the content would be, so in order for me to be able to do that, I'm really not going to be able to make all the desserts this year, but I can order some, or we can go a whole nother route. What direction would you want to go?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a million examples of this, right? Sometimes it's just straight up no, like I'm not going to be able to make it, or I'm not going to be able to be part of that. You don't always have to have a solution, a different solution, but to be able to invest the time before you have the conversation, whenever possible. What do you actually want?
Mm-hmm.
What do you actually want versus what is it you don't want? So many people think boundaries are like, I don't want to be stressed. I don't want to be overwhelmed. I don't want to be feeling like guilted into this. I don't want to feel like it's another thing on my list of a million things I have to do. Okay, great. That's great to know what you don't want. But what do you want? Mm-hmm. And so the intent and the content is always about what you want, not what you don't want. Because as soon as you start going into, I don't want us to feel stressed out and overwhelmed and burdened at this party, you're then putting that energy out as is expectation of what's going on versus I know that we both want to have a lot of fun and this is all about celebrating and having a good sense of flow and right. And so that's like, yeah, that is what I want versus like it starts to close you down when you talk about what you don't want and you want people to not experience together. So that's a really powerful way of retraining yourself.
Yeah.
Of intent before content. What do you want? How do you want it to feel? Say that first and then shut your mouth and see how they respond, really. And then after that, then go into, so here's what I'd like, or here's what I'm thinking, or what do you think about, or how might we go about, right? You don't even have to always have the solution to the boundary.
Yeah.
You can even say, I'm not able to do this. What are your thoughts on who else might be able to, or what else we might be able to do? Mm-hmm. That's the other thing to remember is you don't always have to have the answers. It's actually really empowering and it becomes more of a communal experience when you're on the team together, when you're finding the solution together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting because I feel like I would always lead with, because I have da 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 da, and I would explain myself away to be like, okay, do you have compassion for why I can't do this?
Yeah, exactly. And that's so common too, of like, I have to tell a big story about why I can't. This was one of the best things my therapist ever taught me. I used to do that all the time when I was invited to events. I rarely go to anything anymore unless I'm like hanging out with friends, but I rarely go to like networking events and, award ceremonies. I used to do that like out the wazoo, and that's just not a part of my life anymore. But there was this level of like, I felt like I had to, like if somebody invited me and I felt like it made me like a bad person if I didn't show up, especially if they had just come to my event and I felt like I had to reciprocate or I wasn't a good person, right? Stories, right. stories. And so to be able to get to a place of recognizing that it's not a scorecard, life is not a scorecard. We often do that. One of my mentors called it love accounting, where we keep track of the love on both tally marks of who does what and like that kind of thing. And so being able to say, all right, what do I need right now? And it has nothing to do with any other factors or any other stories. And how can I express myself without needing to get into making them understand and feel compassionate for me? This is the best line ever. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have another commitment.
That's it.
Done. My therapist taught me that because I used to do exactly what you're talking about, Natalie. I felt like I had to explain myself and like go deep into the reasoning and like how sorry I was. Mm-hmm. And it was like, I shouldn't say nobody. The majority of human beings are not offended by you saying, thank you for inviting me. I have another commitment. And I'll tell you, I've never once had a single person ask me what the commitment was. And you are allowed to make the commitment with yourself in front of the TV, if that's what you need.
Love it. That would be super ballsy for someone to say, well, what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, and I really thought they would, yes. I almost felt like I was going to be called out for being a bad person. I really thought that. And so my big challenge that my therapist gave me was like, why don't you test it out? How else will you know? If they do ask you, you can tell them, or you can tell them, it's personal. I'm not really in a place to share that, right? You can decide what boundaries you have with it. But I'll tell you, I mean, it's the kind of thing that has been so rewarding to acknowledge versus like just ignore and hope they don't follow up, right? But to actually acknowledge and say, I appreciate being considered for this, being invited to this, whatever it is, but I'm just not available. I'm just not available, and end it. And it's really, this one for you, especially Natalie, based on what you just described, will be a really great muscle to strengthen around what is the least amount of words you can use to decline.
I keep that in my head. Like, I really love your suggestion, though.
Yeah, the least amount of
invitation, but I have another commitment. Yeah.
Yes, and people are like, oh, okay, thanks for telling me. That's like 9 out of 10 times. That's what it is.
Yeah. But to your point, I tell myself the stories in my head. Oh, they're going to be mad at me or or call me out, and I don't want to lie to them. But I don't really want to do it either. So I know it's the whole big song and dance, and it does.
Like boundary with yourself.
Yeah,
right. That's a perfect description of a boundary with yourself, because that is your mind telling you that something's wrong with this situation, and you have to make it right by over explaining, by going deep into details, by making sure they understand how overwhelmed you are. I once had a person who wanted to reschedule a call with me, and it was because their father-in-law was in the hospital, and they wrote to me in the email, will you give me permission to visit my father-in-law in the hospital? And it wasn't the right time for like a coaching moment. This was not a coaching client. This was somebody who was just, a mutual leader in the community who wanted to just connect. And so it was just the weirdest thing that I think so many people do. It's just the way that they had phrased it was like what people are thinking, but they don't usually write.
Right. Exactly.
People are usually thinking like, oh my God, please have them acknowledge that I can't make it to this call and like whatever, versus truly saying like, will you grant me the permission to do what I need to do? And then that makes the other person, me in the case, feel pretty shitty actually.
Absolutely.
Because I was like, what kind of question is that? Like, of course you should do that. And also it's not a question. It's a statement of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. But it helped me to understand, this person's a coach themselves. And so it helped me to understand just how prevalent it is in these really inappropriate stories that we tell ourselves about what it means to be polite, or what it means to be rude, or what it means to be reliable, or what it means to be a good friend or a good person. And so then we create all these crazy things that we think this is really going to hurt this other person. And the reality is most of the time it is not actually a big deal. I mean, there can be times that it is, but like most of the time it's not. And it's a big deal with yourself. And so being able to evolve and graduate to a place where you can use as little words as possible and to just state your needs from a place of your intention first, and then being able to, be clear when it's something bigger, like a bigger conversation. But otherwise, it's really powerful to start to acknowledge, where am I holding myself back because of what I'm telling myself? And how can I start to rewrite that story? That's actually, I talked about the boundaries boot camp. A huge section of it is limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs, anything that's keeping you from doing your best or achieving what it is that you want, right? And so a limiting belief is like, this is going to let someone down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is just so common, especially when it comes to this like control, right? Feeling like we're in control. And I'll tell you, Natalie, the freedom that happens in your body when you start to collect the evidence of, I can say thank you for the invitation, but I have another commitment. And then people just say, okay, I'll see you next week. Or right. You start to then have new evidence to create new stories of, this is normal. This is something I can do with ease and grace. This is something that I can reprogram myself into knowing. And I'm really proud of myself for going on that journey personally, and for so many people that I've had the pleasure of witnessing and guiding in that, of like, it is freeing, because we waste so much energy and so much time on what we think other people are thinking about us.
100% agree with that. I mean, I feel like that's been my entire life with so many other people out there that are going to listen to this. So piggybacking off of that, how do you balance respecting your own needs with the needs of others when you're setting boundaries?
So it really depends on the situation, right? There are emergencies. Those are real. And there are absolutely times where in a state of emergency, you're going to be prioritizing whatever the most important thing is that may not be going to yoga class that day, right? And so I think the most important thing, though, is to really tune in to your own capacity, right? So I love this exercise. It's a drain fill. I love it. It's really simple. You write down what's draining you, write down what's filling you up. You can understand the bonus is then you attach your values to understanding how your values are connected to what's filling you and how your values are being violated where they're draining you. But it's really powerful to be able to understand, to take a situation that you're in and be able to say, okay, here is what I really need. This is what's draining me the most when it comes to this container that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so what boundaries can I set maybe on this one piece of the situation, whether it's with myself or others, or if it's the kind of thing that it's something I need to be able to articulate differently because I literally can't physically be there. I will pass out. And so I'll give you an example, just this. Unfortunately, we have a very old cat. He's 18 years old and he has recently went blind and he's now having seizures. And so the first couple nights that he had seizures are like at 3:00 in the morning. And my husband is very close to the cat, like very, very, I am too, but it's like more his cat. Mm-hmm. And he was traumatized. Understandably, it's a traumatic emergency. That's an emergency experience. Our cat was flopping around on the floor like a fish out of water, like really sad, really overwhelming, with like basically our child because we don't have biological children. And so he was in this really extreme emergency mode, right? And so I had to be the island of peace and just take charge because I was also in an emergency, but I was able to take action, right? And do something. Mm-hmm. Well, after 2 days of it being like the same kind of energy of like, wow, this is like, what do we do? What do we do? I had to sit down and set a boundary. And I said, look, when he has his next seizure, here is what I need. I need you to be in charge of turning on the lights. I need you to be in charge of breathing deeply. I need you to be in charge of creating the physical environment for him and me to be okay. And here's what I'm going to do. I am going to be responsible for holding him and for supporting him physically in that experience. That's what you can count on me on. And I'm going to go straight to him and you go straight to like the lights and whatever else we need. The next day, it was like we were such a great team. We were this incredible team being able to manage this emergency. But the truth was, after 2 days of having a cat having a seizure and a husband who was having an emotional seizure at the same time, like that was too much. I didn't have capacity for that. And so as much as he has full permission to be human and I understand why that happened to him emotionally. I had to set a boundary of, I don't have capacity to carry all of this for all three of us. Mm-hmm. This is what I need. And this, otherwise I'm going to tap out.
You are human too, MaryBeth. You are human.
Yeah. And hopefully I have a partner who's on the journey too and does the work and has been like, we've been such a team with it ever since then. But if I didn't ever articulate that, we would have just kept having the same, Groundhog Day over and over of like a traumatic experience at 3:00 in the morning, which is when it tends to happen, versus, okay, we have a flow. We know how to move through this. We are a team and we know exactly, we are not traumatized. We are just in a hospice caregiving mode.
Yes. Yes. Well, you did mention, and I wanted to mention this as well, that you and your husband do have a business together, Spark Vision. So I will link all of that stuff in our little right above the episode. But I just want to thank you so, so much, MaryBeth, for joining us today on this episode about boundaries, and wanted to see if you had any other parting words of wisdom, because I want to be respectful of your time too. If there's anything you'd like to share with the listeners on boundaries or personal growth.
Yeah. Well, I think I would close with one of my favorite ways of thinking about boundaries and values, which is that you're not drained from doing too much. It's from doing too little of what reflects your values.
Yes, I love that. Mm-hmm.
And so if you are on a journey of wanting to feel more filled than drained, not knowing, what is the first step to doing that, I am going to invite you, as Natalie said earlier, to take the core values quiz and to start to understand what are the things that give me energy because they reflect my values, and how can I start setting boundaries with the things that aren't, so that I can truly feel a sense of aliveness, energy, and purpose in a daily basis. And that's corevaluesquiz.com. So it's really simple to be able to get to that and take that. It's an amazing, amazing way to start to shed what everybody else expects of you, or what you think you should be, or, just doing what you've always done, and instead moving into who am I authentically at my core, and how can I start to plug the holes that are draining me and to make new choices so that I can feel more filled on a regular basis by activating those values in a way that's authentic to me.
So good. So good. If you haven't read her book, make sure you check out Permission to Be Human. Where can we find you, MaryBeth, if people want to start following you, contact you, if they want to join me and some other people on this journey of self-discovery?
I appreciate that. I have a YouTube channel, which is at Spark Vision. So there's lots of practices and free resources, guided meditations, interviews, so many things you could go deeper into. And I'm really active on social media too. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. MaryBeth Hyland, find it pretty easily that way. But yeah, I'm really grateful to have had this meaningful conversation with you. I can't wait to hear your song. And I look forward to really encouraging anybody who is hearing this and is feeling compelled, is feeling moved, connect with me. I would love to continue the conversation. I am personally checking all of my social media accounts. So know that if you reach out to me and send me a note, I would love to hear what's going on in your journey, and love to be on a journey with other people who are choosing to do the inner work, because we need to remember that we're not alone.
You're amazing. Thank you so much, MaryBeth.
Thank you.